The transmission came through broken and desperate. 17 colony worlds were screaming for help at the same time. Ambassador Yuki Tanaka watched the messages flood her screen, each one more panicked than the last. The Kirith Dominion had given humanity 48 hours to abandon every settlement in the Riven Expanse. After that, they promised extinction point. 3,000 warships were already moving toward the frontier. The Dominion had conquered dozens of species over 4 centuries. None had survived resistance. The Coalition Council met within the hour. 12 species sat around the chamber, and 12 species agreed on one thing. Running was the only option. The mathematics were simple. The Dominion could not be defeated. Humanity should accept this truth and evacuate while they still could. Yuki argued against surrender. She spoke of the millions who had built lives on those colonies. She spoke of children who had never known any other home. She spoke of what it meant to abandon people to monsters. The Valari ambassador, a being made of living crystal, responded with cold logic. Sentiment would not stop plasma cannons. Humanity could rebuild elsewhere. Fighting meant species-wide suicide. The vote was unanimous. The coalition would not help. Evacuation orders went out immediately. 600 light years away. Captain David Okonkwo received the broadcast on his destroyer, the HSS Defiance. He was the only human military presence in the entire region. Every other warship was days away at maximum speed. David was 43 years old. He had served in the Solar Defense Force for 20 years. He had commanded the Defiance for 7 of those years, and in all that time, he had never lost a ship or abandoned a crew member. His 212 sailors trusted him with their lives. He contacted Ambassador Tanaka directly. She told him the truth. The coalition had given up. Help was not coming. The colonies were being abandoned. David asked one question. How long until the Dominion fleet arrived? Yuki checked the projections. Approximately 52 hours if they maintained current speed. David thanked her and closed the channel. Then he turned to his first officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lindqvist, and gave an order that would change galactic history. Set course to intercept the Dominion fleet. Put us directly in their path. Sarah stared at him. She was 34, brilliant, and completely practical. She asked if he understood what he was proposing. One destroyer against 3,000 warships was not a battle. It was a death sentence. David nodded. He understood perfectly. Sarah pressed further. What could one ship possibly accomplish against an entire armada? David thought about his grandmother. She had raised him in Lagos after his parents died. She survived 3 famines, 2 wars, and the collapse of the old nations. Before she died, she told him something he never forgot. The world changes when one person decides it will. He told Sarah they could not save the colonies alone, but they could buy time. They could show the Dominion that humans would not run without a fight. And maybe, just maybe, that would matter. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked what he needed from her. Everything, David said. He needed her to be ready for anything. The Defiance changed course. Within hours, they had positioned themselves directly in the path of the advancing Dominion fleet. One small destroyer floating in the void, waiting for an empire. Word spread quickly. The coalition monitored all military movements, and they immediately demanded to know what David was doing. Yuki contacted him again, this time with fear in her voice. She told him to withdraw. She told him he was going to start a war humanity could not win. David asked her what humanity was supposed to do instead. Run forever? Abandon everyone who counted on them? Let the Dominion know that humans would always surrender? Yuki had no answer. The hours passed. The Defiance waited. David's crew prepared for combat. They knew they could not survive. Some wrote letters home. Some prayed. Some simply sat quietly with their friends. Then the Dominion fleet arrived. 3,000 ships dropped out of hyperspace at once. They filled every sensor screen, every viewport, every corner of visible space. Warships the size of cities. Carriers holding thousands of fighters. Weapons platforms capable of cracking planets. Against all of that stood one destroyer. The Dominion commander, Warlord Thess, opened a communication channel. His species resembled massive armored insects, all chitin and blade-like limbs. He had destroyed civilizations. He had exterminated entire species. He had never encountered anything like this. His message was simple. Move aside, human. Do this, and you may live. David stood on his bridge, surrounded by his crew, facing impossible odds. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the colonies behind him. He thought about what it meant to be human. He opened a channel to the Dominion fleet. No, the word hung in space between them. One syllable, one refusal, one man telling an empire that this was where the line existed. Thess did not respond immediately. In 400 years of conquest, no one had ever said no to him. He did not quite know what to do with it, but David knew exactly what he was doing. He was not fighting a battle. He was making a statement. He was telling the galaxy that some things mattered more than survival. And somewhere, across the vast distances of space, people were listening. News traveled at the speed of light, through hyperspace relays, and sometimes faster through fear. Within 6 hours, every human settlement in known space had heard the story. A single captain had told the most powerful military force in the galaxy to stop. And somehow, impossibly, they had stopped. Warlord Thess gave David 36 hours to reconsider. The Dominion fleet held position, 3,000 ships waiting in perfect formation while their commander tried to understand what he was seeing. In 4 centuries of conquest, no species had ever challenged him with a single vessel. The gesture was so absurd that Thess suspected a trap. There was no trap. There was only David Okonkwo and 212 crew members refusing to move. David used the time wisely. He recorded a message and sent it to every human colony, every Earth government, every human ship in existence. The message was simple. He explained what he had done. He explained why. Then he asked a question that would echo through history. They told us to run. I said no. Now I need you to decide what kind of species we are. The message reached Earth within hours. Politicians reacted first, and their reaction was panic. David had provoked a war they could not win. He had doomed humanity through arrogance. They demanded his arrest, his court-martial, his immediate removal from command. Military commanders were divided. Some called him insane. Others recognized something else. They saw a line being drawn and wondered if they had the courage to stand on it. But ordinary people understood immediately. Recruitment centers across human space reported crowds gathering before dawn. Retired veterans appeared in old uniforms. Factory managers received thousands of calls demanding their facilities convert to military production. Teachers left classrooms. Doctors left hospitals. Farmers left fields. They were not soldiers. Most had never held a weapon. But they heard the message and they knew what it meant. On the Defiance, Sarah organized the crew for extended combat operations. They ran drills constantly. They checked every system. They prepared for a battle that mathematics said they could not survive. A young ensign named Paolo approached David during one of these drills. He was 22 years old, fresh from the academy, and terrified. He asked David directly if they were going to die. David considered lying. He decided against it. Yes, he told Paolo. They were probably going to die, but their deaths would mean something. They would prove that humans did not surrender. They would give their species time to respond. Paolo was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if David was afraid. David admitted that he was. Fear was natural. Courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was deciding that something mattered more than being afraid. Paolo nodded slowly. He returned to his station without another word. The coalition species watched the standoff with growing disbelief. The Valari ambassador contacted Yuki again, demanding an explanation. What were humans doing? Did they not understand that resistance was meaningless? Did they want to die? Yuki responded with a truth that aliens could not comprehend. Humans would rather die fighting than live running. It was not logical. It was not strategic. It was simply who they were. Hour 30 approached. David stood on his bridge, watching sensor data and waiting. The Dominion fleet remained in position. Thess was clearly studying him, trying to understand his psychology, looking for the angle. There was no angle. There was only stubbornness. Then, at hour 35, something changed. Sarah called David to the sensor station. Her voice was strange, caught between confusion and hope. He looked at the readings and did not understand what he was seeing. A ship had dropped out of hyperspace behind the Defiance. Then another. Then a dozen. Then 100. They were not warships. David recognized the signatures immediately. Cargo freighters, mining vessels, personal yachts, colony transports, passenger liners, civilian ships. Hundreds of them, pouring out of hyperspace and taking position alongside his destroyer. Communications flooded in faster than the crew could process. The voices were old and young, male and female, speaking every language humanity knew. They had heard his message. They had come to stand with him. A grandmother named Lena commanded a cargo hauler. She told David she survived the famines of 2089 and would not run from anyone now that a teenager named Miguel had stolen his father's shuttle. He had never been in space until last week. But he was here that a family of 5 had loaded their personal transport with supplies and flown through 3 hyperspace jumps to reach this point in space. None of them were soldiers. None of them had weapons. They could not fight the Dominion in any meaningful way, but they could stand. David stared at the sensor readings. 417 civilian ships now surrounded the Defiance. 417 acts of pure, defiant courage. His grandmother was right. The world changed when one person decided it would, but sometimes that decision spread like fire. And now the galaxy was watching an entire species catch flame. Lena Petrova was 67 years old and had sworn she would never leave Earth again. Space made her bones ache and the recycled air gave her headaches. But when she heard the broadcast, she walked straight to the spaceport, bought passage on the first outbound freighter, and convinced its captain to change course for the riven expanse. Now she commanded her own vessel, a battered cargo hauler she had purchased from a retiring trader 3 days ago. The ship was older than her grandchildren. Its weapons systems consisted of a single mining laser meant for asteroid work. It would last approximately 4 seconds against a Dominion warship. She did not care. Around her, 416 other civilian ships held formation with the Defiance. More were arriving every hour. News had spread beyond human space now. The Coalition was watching. The Dominion was watching. The entire galaxy was watching a species that had decided, collectively and individually, to stop running. Warlord Thes demanded an explanation. His tactical officers could not identify any weapons on the civilian ships. They were not a military threat. They could not damage his fleet or stop his advance. Yet they refused to move. He opened a channel to David. "What is this? What do you hope to accomplish?" David's answer was simple. "We are showing you who we are." Thes did not understand. In his experience, species facing extinction either surrendered or fought. Humans were doing neither. They were simply existing in his path, daring him to move through them. His subordinates advised ignoring the civilians. The fleet could simply fly around them. But Thes recognized the trap. If he avoided the blockade, he showed weakness. If he destroyed unarmed vessels, he proved that the Dominion murdered innocents. Either way, humans won. He chose a third option. He gave them 1 more hour to disperse. After that, he would advance regardless of who stood in the way. The hour passed in tense silence. On the Defiance, David watched his sensor screens and counted the ships around him. Miners and merchants, families and wanderers, old people who remembered harder times and young people who wanted to build better ones. None of them left. Ambassador Tanaka contacted David with grim news. The Coalition had officially condemned human actions as provocative and dangerous. They were withdrawing all support. No alien species would help them. Humanity stood completely alone. David thanked her for the information. He had expected nothing different. Then something unexpected happened. A coded transmission came through on a frequency humans did not normally monitor. The message was in an old language, one that translation software struggled to process. But the meaning was clear. The Veloxi were reaching out 40 years ago. The Dominion had conquered the Veloxi homeworld. Their species had been enslaved, scattered, reduced to serving their conquerors. But they had never stopped fighting in small ways. Resistance cells existed across Dominion space, waiting for a moment they feared would never come. That moment had arrived. The Veloxi representative spoke carefully. They could not openly support humans. They could not send ships or weapons. But they could provide information. Dominion patrol routes, supply line locations, weaknesses in their fleet formations. And more importantly, they could spread the word. Every conquered species in Dominion territory was watching what humans were doing. For the first time in 4 centuries, someone was saying no. If humans held, even for a little while, rebellions would follow. David absorbed this information. He understood what it meant. They were not just fighting for human colonies anymore. They were fighting for every species the Dominion had crushed. The hour ended. Thes broadcast his final warning. Disperse or DIEN-01 moved. The Dominion fleet began advancing. David addressed his crew one last time. He told them he had never expected this. He thought he was making a final stand. Instead, He had sparked something larger than himself. Whatever happened next, they had already won. They had shown the galaxy that some things mattered more than survival. Sarah stood beside him. She pointed out that they were still massively outgunned. They were still probably going to die. Philosophy was wonderful, but it did not stop plasma cannons. David smiled. He agreed with her assessment. Then he added one observation. They expected us to be afraid. They do not know what to do with us now. The first Dominion ships crossed into weapons range. Targeting systems locked onto the civilian blockade. In moments, firing would begin. David opened a channel to every ship in the civilian fleet. His voice was calm and clear. Hold the line. 417 voices answered as one. Holding. The Dominion had conquered dozens of species. They had never faced anything like this. They were about to learn what humans did when running was not an option. The first ship to die was a freighter called the Maria Santos. It had been carrying agricultural supplies to a colony that no longer existed. Its captain was a man named Roberto who had 3 children back on Earth. He had time to send one final message before Dominion plasma cannons reduced his vessel to atoms. Tell my kids I did not run. 2 more ships died in the next 30 seconds. Their names were added to a list that would grow much longer before morning came. David watched the destruction on his screens and felt something cold settle into his chest. This was real now. People were dying because of his decision. People would continue dying until this was over. He gave orders. The Defiance surged forward into the engagement zone. 1 destroyer against 3,000 warships. But David had no intention of fighting conventionally. He used the civilian ships as cover, darting between them, targeting Dominion command vessels, forcing Thess to either cease fire or risk hitting his own fleet. The night became a deadly dance. Thess had never encountered tactics like this. Human ships were supposed to form battle lines and exchange fire until one side broke. Instead, David fought like a ghost, appearing and disappearing, striking and retreating, always where the Dominion did not expect him. Every time they pressed forward, David was there. Every time they targeted a civilian ship, he drew their fire to himself. The Defiance took hit after hit. Systems failed. Bulkheads crumpled. Crew members died at their stations. But the ship kept fighting. Miguel, the teenager who had stolen his father's shuttle, found himself directly in the path of a Dominion cruiser. Its weapons locked onto him. He had no defenses. He had no weapons. He had nothing but a communications link and a captain who refused to let him die. David talked him through evasive maneuvers, step by step, word by word. Turn here. Accelerate there. Roll now. His voice never wavered, never showed panic. Even as his own ship burned around him, Miguel survived. Barely. Lena Petrova saw a Dominion destroyer lining up a shot on a refugee transport carrying 300 civilians. She did the math instantly. Her cargo hauler could not fight, but it could move. She aimed her ship at the Dominion vessel and pushed the engines to maximum. The collision tore both ships apart. Lena ejected at the last possible moment, her escape pod tumbling through debris. Another civilian ship caught her beacon and pulled her aboard. Her first words were a question. Which ship can I transfer to? She was back in the fight within the hour. Across Dominion space, the Veloxi made their move. On a dozen occupied worlds, uprisings began simultaneously. Slaves turned on their masters. Hidden weapons emerged from secret caches. Communications networks that the Dominion thought they controlled suddenly broadcast human messages. Hold the line. Thess received reports of rebellions spreading like wildfire. He was forced to divert ships to suppress them, weakening his assault on the human blockade. For the first time in centuries, the Dominion was fighting on multiple fronts. On the Defiance, David collapsed. A direct hit to the bridge had thrown him against a console, cracking ribs and opening a gash across his forehead. Medical teams rushed to stabilize him while Sarah took command. She was 34 years old. She had served under David for 6 years. She knew his tactics, his philosophy, his absolute refusal to abandon anyone. She became him. The fighting continued through the night. Hour after hour of running battles. Hour after hour of civilian ships dying to buy time they did not have enough of. Hour after hour of the Defiance holding together through willpower and engineering genius. David regained consciousness near dawn. He found Sarah still at his station, covered in someone else's blood, still giving orders. He tried to speak. She told him to shut up and focus on not dying. He looked at the tactical display. 109 civilian ships destroyed. The Defiance was barely functional. But they were still here. Then Sarah pointed to the edge of the sensor range. New signatures were appearing. Lots of them. David forced himself upright despite the pain. He watched the readings change. His heart began pounding. Ships. Warships. Human warships, 1,700 of them, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. The combined human fleet. Every military vessel humanity possessed. They had pushed their engines beyond safety limits. They had cut travel time from 72 hours to 12. They had come. Admiral Rosa Medina opened a channel. Her voice was ice and fury. Captain Okonkwo, this is Fleet Command. We have the situation from here. David smiled through blood and pain. He opened his own channel to Warlord Thess. You should have moved faster. The Dominion had 40 years of easy conquests behind them. They had never faced a species like this. The Fury had arrived. Admiral Rosa Medina had waited 30 years for this moment. She had studied the Dominion since she was a lieutenant. She had written tactical assessments that her superiors ignored. She had warned anyone who would listen that war was inevitable. No one had listened. Until now, she commanded the combined fleet from the flagship HSS Vengeance, a dreadnought twice the size of anything the Dominion had ever encountered. Around her, 1,700 warships fell into attack formation. Every vessel humanity possessed, every weapon they had built, every crew member who had volunteered for what they knew might be a one-way mission. They had spent the last 3 days watching civilians die to buy them time. There was no mercy left in them. The engagement began without warning. Human ships were smaller than Dominion vessels, but they were faster and crewed by people who had stopped caring about survival. They cared about winning. Medina had developed her tactics specifically for this enemy. She knew the Dominion relied on overwhelming firepower and psychological intimidation. They expected prey to panic and scatter. Instead, she gave them hunters. Human destroyers swarmed larger Dominion ships, overwhelming their targeting systems. Cruisers punched through defensive lines and struck command vessels directly. Fighters flew suicide runs into engine cores. David, despite his injuries, refused to leave the bridge of the Defiance. His ship could not fight anymore. Half the weapons were offline, and the hull had more patches than original plating. But it could still communicate. He became the tactical hub. He coordinated rescue operations for escape pods. He identified priority targets for the fleet. He maintained contact between military and civilian vessels. He was everywhere and nowhere, a voice in the darkness guiding humanity's fury. Warlord Thess watched his fleet begin to crumble and realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. Humans were supposed to be weak. Their psychology was supposed to be fragile. They were supposed to surrender when faced with superior force. Instead, they had sent civilians to die buying time for their warriors. They had held an impossible line for 12 hours. And now they were fighting like nothing he had ever seen. He contacted David directly. He demanded to understand. What kind of species chose death over survival? What kind of people sent grandmothers and teenagers to face warships? David's answer was simple. The kind that does not know how to quit. The coalition observers watched in stunned silence. The Valari ambassador had predicted human extinction. Instead, she witnessed something that challenged everything she understood about warfare. The humans were not just surviving. They were winning. Reports flooded in from across Dominion space. The Veloxi rebellions had spread to 17 conquered species. Slave populations that had been docile for generations were suddenly rising up. Communications networks broadcast human messages on every channel. Hold the line. The words meant something different now. They were not a command. They were a promise. They were proof that resistance was possible, that empires could be challenged, that the Dominion's reign was not eternal. Thess ordered a retreat. For the first time in 400 years, Kirith ships turned and fled from battle. But human vessels pursued them. Admiral Medina was not interested in letting them escape. She wanted the galaxy to see the Dominion broken. On the Defiance, David finally collapsed again. The medical officer had warned him that continuing would kill him. He had ignored her until the moment his body simply stopped cooperating. Sarah took full command. She was exhausted and wounded, but she did not stop. David had taught her that stopping meant death. Movement meant survival. Purpose meant everything. She directed the final push. Human ships surrounded the Dominion command vessel. Thess had a choice. He could surrender and face the humiliation of defeat. Or he could die. He chose to broadcast one final message to his people. His voice was heavy with something that might have been respect. I have found a species we cannot conquer. Then he destroyed his own ship. The explosion was visible across the battlefield. The Dominion fleet scattered. Some vessels surrendered. Others fled into hyperspace. Others fought to the death. But the battle was over. The tide had turned. David heard about the victory from his hospital bed. Sarah stood beside him, still covered in blood and burns, still refusing to rest until she knew he would survive. That he asked about the colonies. Sarah told him they were safe. The Dominion advance had been stopped. He asked about the civilian fleet. Sarah hesitated. 109 ships destroyed. Over 1,000 people dead. But 308 ships survived. 308 crews who had stood against an empire and lived. David closed his eyes. The weight of command pressed down on him. 1,000 people dead because he had refused to move. But 17 colony worlds survived. Millions of lives saved. 17 conquered species rising in rebellion. A galaxy transformed. His grandmother would have understood. The world changed when one person decided it would. Sometimes the cost was terrible. Sometimes it was worth paying anyway. Sarah squeezed his hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They had won. 1 year later, the Dominion no longer existed, not destroyed, dissolved. 23 conquered species had risen against their masters in the months following the Battle of the Riven Expanse. Without their fleet, without their warlords, without their reputation for invincibility, the Kirith found themselves facing enemies on every border. They sued for peace. The galaxy that had feared them for 4 centuries watched them beg for mercy from species they had enslaved. David Okonkwo heard the news from his office on Earth. They had promoted him to admiral despite his protests. He wanted a ship, not a desk. But Sarah had convinced him that leading a fleet meant protecting more people than commanding a single vessel ever could. She was right. He hated that she was usually right. The promotion came with responsibilities. Meetings with politicians. Strategic planning sessions. Diplomatic functions where aliens who had abandoned humanity now wanted to be friends. David found himself longing for the simplicity of combat. Ambassador Tanaka visited him on the anniversary of the battle. She brought news from the coalition. They wanted humanity to join as a senior member species. Full voting rights. Military cooperation. Economic integration. David asked what the price was. Tanaka smiled. There was no price. The coalition had learned something from watching humans stand alone. They had learned that alliances meant nothing if you abandoned your allies when times got hard. The new treaty included provisions David had demanded. No more abandoning civilians. No more surrendering populations to aggressors. No more pretending that some lives mattered less than others. That he thought about Warlord Thess and his final message. I have found a species we cannot conquer. The words had spread across the galaxy. They had become a warning and a promise. Humans were not the strongest species. They were not the smartest. But they were the most stubborn. Miguel, the teenager who had stolen his father's shuttle, graduated from the Solar Naval Academy. He had grown 4 inches in the past year. He had learned to fly properly. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. David attended his graduation ceremony. Afterward, Miguel approached him with a question he had been holding for 12 months. He asked if David had known the fleet was coming when he made his stand. David told him the truth. No, he had not known. He had assumed he was going to die. He had assumed everyone who joined him was going to die. He made his decision anyway. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he understood. Sometimes you had to choose between survival and meaning. Sometimes meaning was more important. Lena Petrova received the highest civilian honor humanity could bestow. She attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, her body still recovering from the collision that saved 300 lives. When they gave her the medal, she handed it to her granddaughter. She told reporters she did not need medals. She needed to know that next time, people would not run. That was enough. The ceremony marking the anniversary of the battle took place at the site itself. Thousands of ships gathered in the Riven Expanse, exactly where the blockade had formed. Military vessels, civilian transports, ships from 17 species that had won their freedom because humans refused to surrender. The Veloxy ambassador spoke about what David's stand had meant to conquered peoples across the galaxy. For 40 years, they had believed resistance was impossible. One destroyer and 400 civilian ships had proven them wrong. David gave a short speech. He was never comfortable with public speaking. He said he did not do anything special. He just refused to move. Everyone who came after him made the real difference. Sarah, standing behind him, whispered something only he could hear. That is exactly what makes it special. After the ceremony, David visited the monument they had built from the remains of the Defiance. His ship would never fly again, but it would never be forgotten either. On its hull, they had inscribed every name, every ship that stood with him, every person who refused to run. 2034 names. He knew them all. A young officer approached him. She had just received her first command, a patrol ship on the frontier. She said she joined the Navy because of what he did at the Riven Expanse. She asked if he had any advice for her. David looked at her. He looked at the stars. He looked at the monument to stubbornness and fury and the absolute refusal to surrender. When they tell you to run, he said, ask yourself what happens if everyone runs. Then decide if you can live with that answer. She nodded slowly. She understood. David turned back to the monument. He ran his fingers over the cold metal. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about every person who had followed him into impossible odds. He thought about what it meant to decide that the world would change. The galaxy was different now. Not because of grand fleets or superior technology. Because one man had said no. Because a species had chosen to stand with him. Sometimes that was all it took.